Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Reverend Stephen Milton, and I'm going to be talking about Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. Richard Rohr is someone who has made quite a name for himself as a leader of, at least in America, the contemplative Christianity movement. He was born, or at least raised in Kansas, born in 1943. He was, or rather is, a Catholic priest by training, did a lot of prison chaplaincy for quite a few years, and now runs a center in New Mexico, which is known for its wonderful newsletter. He founded the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. If you want to hear more from Richard Rohr, I highly recommend just subscribing to their daily newsletter. It's really, really helpful. And as I said, he's a prominent proponent of contemplative Christianity. And back in 2011, he released Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. And the book is really a Christian perspective on what life is about, particularly the second half of life. He talks about life being divided into two halves, and he makes the argument that the second half of life can be a very rewarding and in some ways spiritually much richer time of life than the first half of life. The first half of life, he argues, is when you're creating a container for your life. When parents raise children, children are, of course, very impulsive and need to learn all the basics, from toilet training to saying please and thank you, how to eat properly, how to eat politely, how to get along with others without hurting them or hurting themselves. There's actually a ton of things which we need to learn as children. They can't just be let loose and hope for the best. They have to be put into a very structured environment so that they can learn how to live safely and live sociably. And Rohr talks about this as being a kind of container, and this is something which you build starting in childhood, but going outward through the first half of your life, you're building a container for your life, all the sorts of trappings that will define who you are. Why don't I let him talk about it and explain this to you himself.
But you have to have a container. You have to say, I am this, even if you start by doing it negatively. And you do this by the way you dress, the people you associate with, the education you get, the ethnicity you identify with, the color of your skin, your sexual orientation. All of this says, I am this, I am this. It's okay. There's not much depth to it yet, but you got to do it. And you got to do it to get started. The trouble is, you become so identified with the container that you spend the rest of your life protecting it, promoting it, defending it, proving it's the best. I always say, I grew up in Kansas, which in some ways no way prepared me for the life that I've lived. And on another level, absolutely prepared me, because I couldn't have grown up, probably like a lot of you, much more conservative, traditional. We just thought we were the heart of America, of course, the state right in the center. We were the home of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz and everything good and wonderful about America. We didn't question very much, particularly in the 40s and 50s when I was growing up. We just knew that America was the best country in the world, and we were right at the heart of it. Then, no offense to any other denomination that might be here, but I was Roman Catholic, And of course, we were the mother church. We just didn't understand why anybody else wouldn't want to be Catholic. Everybody else was heretics, barely going to heaven. It was a wonderful way to begin, In fact, we never really put down Protestants. I never heard an anti-Protestant sermon my entire life, We just felt sorry for you. Felt very sorry. Those poor things, they have such ugly churches, and They just don't know how to decorate churches the way we do.
So he spoke about a container, and Rohr's idea is that when you're in the first half of life, from childhood through to your late 40s or so, you're building a container. You're building the edifice of what you are, right? So as children, we're taught all the rules and regulations about how to become an adult. But then you graduate from high school and you want to get a job and you want to get an education and you're probably looking for a mate and maybe you want to have some children and you go to a lot of conferences and you try and you're wanting to build your career and build your reputation, right? You want to have a good reputation in your career and you want to get ahead. So you're sort of building your identity, but it's your social role, the external aspect of you. And he calls this the container. And this is utterly critical for your development. It's absolutely, really, really critical, he argues. And along the way, while you're doing that, you need to build some self-esteem. It's not just about learning all the rules, but you need to be encouraged along the way that you're doing a good job, that you're a good person. And you think about all those rituals that we have as kids are growing up, right? There's graduation ceremonies, and I don't know, I think there's probably some grandparents here. You may have noticed that graduation used to be something you only did when you got out of high school and university. Now it seems to be at every stage of school. There's grade 6 graduations. There's graduations from nursery school. There's graduations from kindergarten. There's all these steps at which we want our children to have a strong sense of self and achievement, and we give it to them regularly, gold stars and so forth. And of course, when we get older, that's even more important. Just think of how brides are treated on their wedding day. We've got lots of people who have been brides here. What were you told about the big day as a bride? How were you supposed to feel, and how was everybody supposed to treat you? Anybody remember that day?
I remember a story. It might not tie into the point you're making, but I don't normally wear makeup. That's just who I am, coming out of like a hippie in the 60s, a wannabe hippie in the 60s. And so I didn't have makeup on my wedding day. And I remember my to-be mother-in-law and sister-in-law literally chasing me around the house with rouge and lipstick, saying, "You've got to put makeup on." And I was saying, of all days, this is the one day where I want to be myself. He's got to marry me, not some image.
Right. But as your family was saying, there's a lot of image making happening when you get married, right? On the wedding day. Well, who's more important, the groom or the bride on the wedding day? You guys are too modest. Come on. Women are told this is your big day. This is the most important day of your life. You may not believe that anymore, but I mean that's certainly what people get told, right? There's bridal magazines. There's not a whole lot of groom magazines. All I'm trying to say is that we go through a whole bunch of ceremonies and rituals during our adult life till around the age of 45 or so, where we are being encouraged to think highly of ourselves, right? Birthday parties become of less interest as we get older. Maybe we don't want to admit some of the numbers that are attached to us, but little kid birthday parties are a really big deal, right? And why is that? Because we want them to feel good about themselves. We want them to feel special for the day, right? So self-esteem is really, really important. And Rohr says, okay, so you got to learn the rules of life and you got to build self-esteem. You got to build a healthy ego where you can be proud of the things that you're doing. That's important. But eventually, part of being a healthy adult is you need to break free from the people and the institutions which gave you all those values, which helped you survive this far. Teenagers argue with their parents, right? If it's kind of hard to get through life with teenagers without them at some point rebelling and breaking the rules. Can you guys give any examples of ways in which perhaps yourself or others have rebelled against their parents or institutions that were trying to give them values?
I grew up in what you might call a high demand religious household. We were one light bulb in the car away from being Amish, if you will. But, and but I gradually, like many other adolescents, and then on to university, but started to think about in ways that weren't consistent. And the answer always was, you know better. You've received, truth wrapped in a red bow. Don't mess with it. By the way, and that has led me to think with raising that. Obviously, my wife was the more important presence and force, but I always thought that our role as parents was to prepare them for autonomy and independence and a sense of self-worth, not to hold on to any emotional leashes or tethers. So.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Lots of parents feel that way. And that's the way I raised my kids too. I told them I was out the door when I was 17. I expect the same of you. Now, I didn't know about Toronto rents and housing prices back then, so that didn't quite work. But so what are some of the ways in which young adults rebel, though? I mean, it's not just with our parents. What are some of the other things which we leave behind or we push against?
Clothing, the way they dress.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. Just think of the ways in which you don't agree with your children or grandchildren.
Or even understand what they're saying.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, one obvious example is that how many 20-year-olds do we have in church on Sunday morning? We had them when they were 10, right? We had them in Sunday school when they were 10, but by the time they're 20, they have no interest in being in that institution anymore. Right? They feel like they've graduated when they get confirmed, and they have no intention of looking back. And the census, all the various censuses and polls keep saying the same thing in the United States and Canada, that people under the age of 40 are increasingly reporting that they are not affiliated with any religion. Right. Even though a lot of them went through religion as Sunday school kids, they now say, nope, I'm not affiliated with any. And if you know any young adults who are involved in non-governmental organizations, organizations that do good work, there's lots of lapsed Catholics in those groups. They inherit their parents' value systems, but they reject the source of it. They say, this Christianity stuff's not for me. However, they still believe in justice, so they go fighting for it. One of these days, I was at a demonstration this morning. I should have done a straw poll just to see how many of them are ex-religious people, because I bet there'd be a lot. You hang on to the justice, but you let go of the institution which taught it to you. Rohr quotes the Dalai Lama in this regard. And he says, learn and obey the rules very well, so you will know how to break them properly. That's part of breaking free, right? Like, you need the rules, you need all that structure, but you also need to know when it's time to break away from them. Now, Rohr argues that, so that's the first half of life, right? So you've built your career, you've got married to somebody, maybe you've had some children, you've got a reputation at work, you've got all these things which define you in terms of a whole bunch of social roles, a whole bunch of those. And then the second half of life can begin. And he likens it to a container. And when he talks about a container, he talks about a teacup. He says it's like you spent the first half of your life creating a teacup, where you chose the decorations on it, the shape of it, how deep it is, the handle. And then the question is, what are you going to do with your container? Because what happens, right, is you get all these skills and you reach 50, maybe 60, depending on what career you're in, you start to get phased out. You feel you're at the top of your powers. You've never known more. And yet society's saying, no, we're going to phase you out. But you feel, well, wait, I've just figured out who I am. I've got all this together. What am I going to do with it? Another way of thinking of that would be like, you've been building a car while you've been driving it. And finally, you got all the pieces together and you got to decide, okay, so where do I go with this thing? I know who I am, but where do I go? And And Rohr argues that this is a tremendous opportunity. It's a really good opportunity, but it's also one which people struggle with. When it's done well, when the second half of life is done well, people figure out who they are and what they care about, and they do it. I go to lots of funerals now because of this line of work. Funerals are fascinating. Funerals are like the one time you get to see anybody's life from start to finish, right? You find out about, they were born in North Bay and they were like this when as a kid and all that stuff, and you hear about them all the way to the very end. And I find it fascinating that, often it's in the second half of life that people, decide they're going to volunteer for this. And they never volunteered for that before they retired, but they start volunteering for that afterwards, and they become really committed to it. Or they take up a new hobby, or they just take something that they were only doing a little bit and it becomes a really big part of their life. So that's a form of deepening, right? Where you're figuring out who you are. But Rohr's book isn't about, the virtues of taking on hobbies. He's more interested in the question of spiritual depth and really figuring out who you are. And he thinks that America is not actually a very good place to do that. And I think this could be extended to North American society generally, that at least Canada and the United States, that we value the first half of life so much that we kind of ignore the second half and the sort of spiritual fruit that it can bear. So let me show you another clip of what he has to say about this.
It's like, I'm convinced, of course, salvation is not a question of if. Salvation is a question of when. How soon do you get it? How soon can you get what's real and what's unreal? What's essential and what's not essential? What lasts and what doesn't last? What's wonderful and what isn't worth a hill of beans? Huh? And we don't get that very quickly in our culture. I am told the American culture of the last 30 years especially, since the proliferation of the media, is the only culture in human history that has idealized teenagers over elders. This is utterly upside down culture, Go to Asia, go to India, go to any of the ancient cultures. What you idealize is being 60 years old. Now maybe I want to say that since I'm there now. But we're not going to get anywhere by all wanting to be, teenagers. It really shows a very, very upside down notion. For me, what it shows is we're a first half of life culture. And as a priest, I find that the Christian churches largely do the task of the first half of life over and over and over and over and over again. Just keep reassuring you. I mean, how many times can you get saved on Friday night, I mean, our Catholics just catatonically go to Mass, but sometimes you don't know if they know how to live in communion. They just go to communion, but they're still racists. So, I mean, this doesn't compute. You clearly have not been transformed at any deep level. It's just spinning the prayer wheels of your particular denomination, and you keep doing it over and over again to reassure yourself of what you have clearly not experienced at a deep level. The alcoholics say what characterizes addiction is to keep doing more and more of what isn't working, right? To keep doing over and over again what isn't working. I've been a priest 42 years. I think an awful lot. I can only pick on Catholics. You'll have to apply this if it applies to your group. But I think we just keep doing it over and over and over again, sometimes with little evidence that people are growing.
Yeah, he's talking about and other authors have said this. Robert Bly wrote a book called The Sibling Society. Christopher Lasch talked about the age of narcissism, that we're kind of, as a culture, we don't want to grow up. We idolize the teenagers of the 1960s. And we don't have a whole lot of time for people who are over their, into their 70s and 80s, unless they found a way to keep their hair, keep their teeth, be fit, and look a lot like younger people. Right? We have a lot of time for beautiful looking models who somehow beat the clock. But the idea that you could be, semi-disabled, using a walker, but still be absolutely critical to an organization's success, that just doesn't play with us. Right? So, Rohr, so how do you get into the second half of life? I mean, your culture's against it, but it's still possible to do. And in fact, lots of people do it even if they didn't want to or even mean to. And the way it happens, Rohr argues, is that you've spent your lifetime building up this container, building up this reputation, building up this successful life, and then something, and you take credit for it, right? You think that, you deserved every raise, you deserved every promotion. The reason your marriage is going so well is because you've made it work. The kids are great because, well, they came from you, and you're great, so they're great. All those things. And then something happens, something that you don't have control over. And it can be the real turning point in your spiritual development.
It's like,
Go past him there. And this is what he talks about. The way you reach the second half of life is that you fail and you fall. Something goes seriously, seriously wrong that you have no control over, and you can't will it out of existence. And it's not something that you wanted to have happen, it just happens. Can people think of any examples of when life goes seriously sideways and you don't have any control and it hurts a lot and you fall on your face?
Yeah, for me, it was in my early 50s, and Eric and I had relocated to Halifax. He was going back to school. The month he turned 50, he started his MDiv. Wasn't working. I was the only one working. And I took a job at one of the hospitals, teaching hospitals in Halifax in the 90s as a vice president of nursing patient care. And it was a horrible existence for me. I was probably not in the right position. All we did was rewrite business plans and lay people off. And I had come from Toronto, and they'd had a big Pete Marwick thing and had deficits for about almost 10 years. So I did this for 8 years. We merged the two hospitals, the maternity hospital and the children's hospital. And I took that job in the merger. And in the midst of that, I had my brother died with cancer just a month after he turned 50. And I'd already had one of my brothers die when he was 22. And I blew apart with unresolved grief, I think. And just, I lost my sense of who I was. And then the hospital went into a whole restructure, going to something called program management. And my position wouldn't exist. I was going to have to apply for another position. And I was turning 55 in a few weeks. And maybe London Life and their advertising influenced me. But I just came up against a wall. I cannot do this anymore. And it was, I'm sitting here thinking about it. It was so hard. But that 180 turn in my life led to enrichment and places I never expected to be. And it's been really wonderful. About 6 months after I retired, I went to the island of Iona off the west coast of Scotland with 2 Crestons. What am I supposed to do now? And am I a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? And spent 2 weeks there on my own with just a backpack, last week in October, first week in November, and had some really, they talk about that being a thin place, and sitting on the 10th day, sitting on the Martyrs Beach, and had the experience of what I can call God, a voice saying, the work I want you to do will be gentle. And I remember not another soul around anywhere. I remember saying so loud, well, what the hell does that mean? And so if I go on now 25 years later, it's been unfolding. So yeah, when I think back, in Nova Scotia, they picketed the legislature with my name on signs, this big bad Marilyn Bacon from Toronto who was messing everything up, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eric's in school. I'm the only salary. Our kids are just graduating from university, and they were both in Western. But so it happens. I could tell you about Eric too, when he was downsized at 47 as an executive in the life insurance company administration. And then 3 years later finds himself doing his MDiv and wanting to be ordained as a minister in the United Church. So that was another whole story too. So yeah, it happens at 50, 55, get you.
Yeah. Anybody else have experiences like that where you hit a wall you didn't want to hit, but there was your face against the wall? Divorces can be like this, you know. A
I
divorce.
didn't hit a wall, but I jumped out of a truck, a 350, a Ford 350, because I was determined I was going to get down onto the ground. I did, but not the right way.
Was that when your bus was hit?
No, I was with Bonnie's oldest son, and he'd pick me up for dinner, and he had this big truck, and I decided before he brought my manual wheelchair around to help me that I was going to jump. So the door was open and he was assisting me, but I didn't realize how far it was from the top of the truck to the ground. And I didn't end up on the good side of that.
Yeah, sometimes it can be a car accident. It can be, you know, a stroke, a cancer, an encounter with cancer, or just something where you feel kind of helpless, where your ego is not going to be able to fix this. Something which is often just completely humiliating. Yeah, Wendy.
I'll spare all the gruesome details and just give an abbreviated version of, I moved to Toronto from Connecticut 10 years ago and had such a naive idea of what it would be like to move to Canada, not really thinking of it as a foreign country, but it really is a foreign country. And I had an experience in Service Ontario trying to get a driver's license in Ontario, where they said I had to turn in my Connecticut license. And I never realized how identified I was with having this driver's license, which I had my whole life, like from the time I was 16. And I had to hand it over to this woman, and I begged her, could you make a copy of it, a photocopy of it? So that was the beginning of many difficult, including the immigration process, many difficult obstacles.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you talk to people who have been refugees or immigrants from very far away, even further away than Connecticut, they often seem very mature, you know, because they've gone through so much. They've had to shed that first identity that they had in their home country and just had to completely reinvent themselves and have just encountered so much hardship that they know they're not in control. You know, if you remember Tom Wolfe's book, The Bonfire of the Vanities,
Yeah.
where, you know, Tom Hanks plays, is it Tom Hanks? No. Yeah.
Yeah.
He plays a master of the universe, right? One of those traders who just makes money hand over fist. Nothing bad could ever happen to him. And of course, something does. You know, we and our society congratulates us for being totally in control, being able to be totally in control, and every success is something that we deserve, right? You know, we worship people like Rihanna and Beyonce because it's just one success after another, after another, after another. But in real life, most of us will spin out at some point. Something bad will happen that we have no control over at all. And it'll hurt a lot, and it'll be humiliating, and we'll be reduced. We'll think that our control over our life is gone. And our society suggests that we not have experiences like that. But, you know, you don't get to control whether you have cancer or most car accidents. Whether your spouse becomes an alcoholic or addicted to something, or you become an alcoholic or addicted to something, right? Like, these things happen. And Rohr argues that all the spiritual traditions all over the world believe that that suffering is actually an opportunity. It may be the best thing that ever happened to you, because it can be the catalyst for you realizing seeing your life from a different angle and realizing some deeper truths about how to live. And this is the initiation to the second half of life. And it doesn't happen on a schedule. This may not have happened in your 50s. It may have happened because your spouse passed away and you suddenly have to reinvent yourself completely. Here's a quote from him. "It's not that suffering or failure might happen, or that it'll only happen to you if you're bad," which is what religious people often think, "or that it will happen to the unfortunate, or to a few and other places, or that you can somehow by cleverness or righteousness avoid it. No, it will happen, and to you. Losing, failing, falling, sin, and the suffering that comes from those experiences. All of this is a necessary and even a good part of the human journey. As my favorite mystic, Julian of Norwich, put it in her Middle English, sin is behovely."
Oh, lovely.
And this is something which early Christians talked about quite a lot. They argued that when hardship comes, it's a gift from God because it is a purifying fire. It's there to burn out the impurities. They talked in terms of metallurgy back then because more people understood how metals were purified. And they said, when God sends you hardship, welcome it and learn from it. Because a whole bunch of false assumptions about yourself are about to go if you let them go. And then you'll be left with something more pure, the silver, without any impurities. And religious language has sort of evolved and made it sound like if something bad happens to you, maybe it's because you were a sinner or God's trying to punish you. But back then they said, I think Jerome says this at one point, he says, God doesn't bother sending bad things to bad people because they're too thick to understand the potential. They won't get it. They'll miss the learning opportunity. So God lets them party until they drop or until misfortune catches up with them. But good people can expect trouble. And they should welcome the trouble and learn from it. Now that is, as our indigenous friends would say, strong medicine and hard medicine, right? And it goes completely against the grain of Western culture. But this is Rohr's argument. And there's a few gleanings, a few realizations that you can get if you have gone through these experiences. First of all, you realize, oh, well, maybe I was never all that much in charge anyway. Right? If you're born white, you're already 10 steps ahead of a whole bunch of people. If you're born male, you're another 10 steps ahead. If you're born in northern Toronto in a nice house, wow, you're just way ahead of most people in the whole world. And these are just things you're born to. You didn't invent them. You can't take credit for them. They're just stuff that was given to you from the outset. And that helps, if you ever volunteer with people who are in rough shape, the homeless or whatever. I did this for a long time. I volunteered at a soup kitchen for 12 years. I can credit them for teaching me that I wasn't so special. That it was just sheer luck that my father hadn't beaten me, or that I hadn't had that mental breakdown in my 20s. Or that I hadn't become addicted to something. I can't take credit for any of those things. I just happened to win a whole bunch of lotteries, one after another, and they didn't. And that was enough to make the difference between me serving the food and them receiving the food. So that's one thing. So you realize, okay, maybe I was never really that much in charge anyway. And so your ego starts to realize, maybe I'm not so great because I can't take credit for all this. And then the other thing is that if you've fallen down some, you can become more forgiving. And this is really important because, if you were a highly judgmental person before, maybe you were a sarcastic young person who, looked at others and made fun of them. Well, after you've had an affair or a divorce, you look at romantic relationships differently, right? You've been around that track, so you can see nuances where other people just see infidelity, sin, idiocy, right? I think it's interesting that the city is not up in arms over Mayor Tory's indiscretion. May be concerned about the age gap right, between him and a staffer, and the fact that it was a staffer. Okay. But the city is not freaking out over the fact that he had an affair because, the city's got a lot of adults in it who know that these things happen. It may not be right. It's never easy. Affairs are about lying, so people always get hurt. But, like the idea that, no, that's always bad and they should go to hell. I mean, fortunately, we don't seem to see things that way, which is good. But can you think of experiences that you've had where you became more understanding of the perceived faults of others after you'd had your experience?
I have from serving meals at the community food center at 40 Oaks in Regent Park.
What did you learn there?
Well, I already knew I was judgmental. I think I just became more understanding, and I guess it's another word for forgiveness. I mean, I already liked the people, but I was sort of detaching I was shedding the judgmental part of it.
Yeah.
It's not very well said, but it was very changing. And most of them were a lot nicer than I am.
Has anyone suffered a period of unemployment that they didn't want? Change your idea about other people who are unemployed? I was unemployed for a while. Changes your idea about other people who are unemployed. John, did you have something to say?
Well, I'm just going to say I've always been unemployed because I work for myself. So I was just going to talk about the fact that just learning that failure is the great teacher. I've made, I was taught to make decisions and live by them. And because I've recognized that in myself, I think I have more empathy for people that have made mistakes. Yeah, and just the, sort of the analogy of falling down. Yeah, I've fallen a lot. So, yeah, so that's the thought.
Yeah, now, of course, you can fall down and not learn a thing from it, right? And you can tell who those people are because they blame everybody else for the fact that they fell down. Right? If everything is everybody else's fault, then you're in the hands of someone who's still solidly in the first half of life. Because, your ego never takes blame for anything. It just blames the world. But, if you've been stuck in one of these situations where you just realize, oh man, I am not as powerful as I thought I was, then that can be a real opening. Can make you more humble, for one thing, can make you more forgiving, which is good. Grandparents are expected to be a little more forgiving than parents, right? Parents are in the first half of life by definition. They're trying to impose rules 24/7 because that's how you keep the kids alive. Fair enough. But grandparents have lived through it all, not just childhood, but parenthood, right? So they understand where the parents are coming from. And they also know that parents can go too far, or parents can sound harsh when they're really loving. They're doing it for loving reasons, but they can sound very harsh. And so kids can find great comfort in grandparents because grandparents can just sort of nod and go, yeah, I know. I know what's going on. I'm not going to say it's right or wrong, but I understand. I get it, right? And that's grandparent wisdom, and it's really, really valuable. It's super valuable.
I think it's Wendy. I think my father died when I was quite a young teenager, and I think that was a falling. That was a sort of I'm not in control. At just the time in life when you're starting to want control. And I kind of annoy my family sometimes because I'm always seeing the other side. I'm always saying that person had that happen in their life. Maybe that accounts for why they're being mean, or you perceive them as mean. I'm always telling a story about other people. Behind their actions and seeing compassion, I guess, extending compassion. to people. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as Rohr says, it's important to have strong values when you're young, and it's important to build up a good ego and self-esteem. But when you hit these walls, and it softens you up, and you get to see, oh, I can't take credit for all of that. You get to see that I'm still a good person, even though all these rotten things have happened to me. So maybe they're actually a good person, even though all those rotten things are happening to them. Or maybe I just see them as a rotten person, but I'm not seeing all the rotten things that happened to them that brought them to this point, right? So yeah, a more contextual way of thinking becomes really important. Rohr uses a metaphor which other spiritual leaders use as well, which is that spiritual development is not a straight line, but a spiral. It's like a spiral staircase. When you're young, your ego is taught to obey rules and law, right? Then you go up the staircase and you come around and you're in exactly the same spot horizontally, if you know what I mean, but in a different spot vertically. And what used to be unbreakable rules, you now realize are often broken rules. And there's lots of exceptions. And not only is your ego in play, but something else comes into play, and that's your soul. And the soul, Rohr would argue that your soul is that part of you which is connected with everything else. Right? Your ego likes to feel separate. Your soul knows that it's connected to everything else and ultimately connected to God, right? It's sort of like the deep roots that go underneath and are actually connected to all the other trees. Even though it just looks like a single tree above ground, it's actually connected to all the other trees. And the difference between the second half of life and the first half of life is that in the first half of life, there's laws and there's rules, and if you break the rules, you're a bad person. Second half of life, you go, you broke the rules, but I don't think you're a bad person. I can see the context, I can see the exceptions, I can see beyond the either or thinking here. You can be an alcoholic, but still a great guy. Whereas when you were younger, you might have just written that person off as a drunk. Right? So it becomes a more nuanced view, and it's your soul that's doing that work, because the soul understands connection, right? And connection is all about context, right? Whereas your ego is about making easy, fast judgments so you can keep going, forward. And Rohr talks quite a bit about how this works with Christianity. When we're young, we think of Christianity as a highly moralistic religion, which is all about, the 10 Commandments, and there's all these rules, and there's a whole lot of sexual morality, which gets pasted onto Christianity. It's amazing what just a couple of letters by someone who might have been Paul can do for the entire religion. But it's rules, 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 rules. And Christianity is often rejected on that basis. But if you actually pay attention to what Jesus is saying, he's not a rule kind of guy. He really isn't. He's constantly forgiving people. He has dinner with sinners. He has dinner with the rule breakers. He has way more fun with the rule breakers than he does with the people who are obsessed about keeping the rules, who are the Pharisees. He keeps them close so he can lecture them and try to get them beyond that rigid rule obediency that they seem so determined to equate with faith, right? And they're the only ones he gets mad at. There's not once that Jesus ever says, "You sinner," blah, 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 blah. He never does that. Lots of preachers have, for sure, right? But Jesus, our Messiah, does not. How often should I forgive my friend who sinned against me? 7 times? No, 7 times 77. Jesus gets people. Jesus always sees that someone's got more dimension to them than simply whatever rule they've broken. And one good example of this is the prodigal son story, which I won't make us read. This isn't a Bible class, but I just want to use it as an example. Prodigal son story, right? So once upon a time, a man has 2 sons. He's got a big estate. He's a farmer. Presumably he's got livestock and stuff. He's got a big estate, and his younger son, who's like 17, says, "Dad, I want 1/3 of my inheritance so I can go off and have a good time in the world." So Dad, against all reason, writes him a check and gives him a third of the estate. And this is your clue that it must be a spiritual story rather than a realistic one, because no dad in his right mind would do that. Because you wouldn't cash in, you wouldn't take out a second mortgage on the house to give to your 17-year-old to give them 1/3 of the house, right? You would not do that. Well, they wouldn't do that to the farm either. Okay, so it must be a spiritual story. So younger son goes out and does what you kind of expect. He's 17 years old, executive function hasn't kicked in yet, so he parties and, has a great time, gets drunk, hangs out with prostitutes, blows all the money in quick order, right? Typical, young, impulse-driven young man. And then he's in trouble because he doesn't have any money. And he just spent all of dad's money way too fast, so he can't go back to dad, so he needs a job. So he gets a job with some Gentiles at the time of a famine. And he ends up feeding the pigs. He's a Jew. Jews don't eat pigs. Jews don't touch pigs. Jews don't go anywhere near pigs. Jews certainly don't take care of pigs. So he has hit rock bottom. And to make it even worse, when he asks during the famine for some extra food from the owner, he says, forget it. So the young man ends up eating the food that the pigs eat. This is called hitting rock bottom. Okay? In AA, you've lost all your friends, you've lost all your money, you've crashed and burned completely, you can't go any lower. That's what this is. And then he goes, well, what am I going to do? This is awful. I can't keep doing this. I'll go back to my father, but I won't pretend to be my father's son anymore. I won't ask him to take me back as a son. I'll ask him to just take me back as a servant. If maybe he'll just treat me like he treats the servants, and at least I'll be well fed, and I'll be working for him, but at least I'll be fed. So he crawls back to his dad, right? He crawls back to his dad. He has no money, okay? So if we're talking about first half of life and second half of life, first half of life, you're building the container of your life, the money, the relationships, the job. He has none of that. He has squandered all of it. He comes back as a zero, right? If you are your container, then this guy is nothing. But his dad welcomes him with open arms, runs out to see him, grabs him, and loves him. And not just that, he's not just glad he came back. He tells the servants in the house, get the best robe, the best shoes, and the fatted calf. We're going to have a feast for this kid today, right now. Why? He's worthless. He's worthless. He's less than worthless. He's blown a third of the estate. The story is a spiritual parable about you are more than just that outside identity. What the boy did right was he came back to his dad. What the boy did right was his soul realized it needed to be reconnected with the source of soul, which is God, because the Father represents God in this reading. He did one thing right. He lost everything. He lost all the stuff his ego could ever be proud of. But he did one thing right, where he realized that he still had an emotional connection to his dad, and he came back to his dad humble. He'd fallen down. His face had been pushed into the ground by life, but he came back humble. And for that, he gets feted. The Bible is constantly telling us, you don't have to be important. In fact, if you think you're important, then you're not very important at all. The last will be first, the first will be last. You need to lose before you can win. And what you'll win is a connection to everything.
Stephen, the other interesting thing is the older brother, right? His reaction. Yeah.
Remember how he reacts?
About the judge.
Yeah. He's really peeved. Why are you doing that for him? He was a loser. He just spent all the money on prostitutes. And the father invites him into the house for the feast, but he refuses to go. We talked about this in our last Bible study. He's the dutiful son. He's the first half of life obedient religious person who thinks that religion is about a bunch of rules, and if you keep all the rules, then you get the gold star. But the trick is, you are keeping all the rules. Your ego is trying to get its way to heaven on its own power. And Rohr's arguing, and most spiritual traditions would agree, it's not until you let go of the ego and demote it and realize it's not really the real you that you start getting access to the big picture. And different traditions do this differently, right? Like Hinduism and Buddhism do it through, well, Hinduism does it through meditation and yoga. Buddhism does it through a lot of meditation, right? Where you're trying to dial down the ego so that that other thing can start to come up, right? And you know,
It's not really that much different from when I was listening to you talk. I was thinking about the hero's journey.
mm-hmm.
You know, in the night starting off, or even the Fisher King, right? That it's all these failures and wounds that actually perfect us, if we can accept the weakness, right?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, King Arthur's a good example for this, because you know, if you remember the King Arthur story, there's Rembrandt, there's King Arthur. King Arthur doesn't know that he is of royal blood, right? He's Pendragon's son, I guess, and he's spirited off in the night. He's raised by a local farmer. The farmer doesn't tell him who he really is, and he just assumes he's a regular Joe until one day the kids are taking, you know, the young adults are taking turns trying to pull Excalibur out of the stone, because whoever pulls Excalibur out of the stone will get to be the King of England. And Arthur has no reason to think that he can do it, but everybody else is doing it, and he pulls it out. And it's a story about amnesia, right? Like, it's a story about what all of us are like, in that we assume that our ego self is our whole self, right? And we're wrong about that, but that's what feels right to us. And yet all the myths tell us, no, actually, you know, you're more than that. And in fairy tales, right, if you think of like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella and the Frog Prince and Beauty and the Beast, right? There's all these stories about a radical transformation that happens to someone where it turns out that they're royalty, but they didn't know it. And they've got to go through a bunch of trials and tribulations to discover that they're royalty. And the royalty, it's not, these stories aren't about upward mobility, right? These stories are about the soul, right? They're about realizing who you are as a person. And that's why they've lasted for so long, and they can be found all over the world. And our movies, you know, I'm a former filmmaker, right? So our movies are all the same, guys. You just clock it. If you watch a feature film, okay, if it's 90 minutes long or 2 hours long, you'll meet a character who's having their normal life, whatever that happens to be. And then at around the 20-minute mark, there'll be a sudden shift. Something will happen, and they will be pushed out of their normal life, and they'll have to go on some sort of quest, or they'll have to go on the road, or they'll have to go chase after some MacGuffin, and they will go through a bunch of trials and tribulations, right? And they will eventually they'll eventually defeat the villain, defeat whatever has been their obstacle in their life, and they will receive a greater degree of understanding they didn't have at the beginning of the movie. That's key, right? Like Luke discovers that he actually has the Force in him, right? Pick your example. This works with every single movie, every good movie. If the hero's character doesn't change over the course of the movie, it's a bad movie. And you'll know it's a bad movie because you'll just find it boring. But what's interesting is the villains never change. They don't have character arcs. They start off evil, they end evil. They are failed human beings. That's what makes them evil. But heroes change, and that's straight out of Joseph Campbell, right? And every Hollywood screenplay is written according to that model. And bad movies, like the Han Solo movie, I don't recommend it, is a bad movie because Han Solo's character doesn't change at all. He has a bunch of adventures, but nothing changes with him. And so it's just boring. You know, whereas something like Breaking Bad is a great story because he starts off as just a high school teacher and he ends up being this terrible drug dealer, right? You know, The Sopranos, this mobster starts to actually have a conscience and starts to have a psychology, and he changes. He never becomes a good person, but he changes all the way through, right? And the fact that we can watch the same movie our entire lives and never get bored with them. We don't go, oh, it's 20 minutes, there's been a plot change, oh God, all movies are like this. We don't have that reaction. And yet that's what happens in every single movie you've ever seen. It's because something about that form of story really speaks to us. It speaks at a level deeper than our ego and our conscious mind. That's why we don't get bored, because something deep down says, I like this story because this is the story of the way things are. This is my story. This is the story of how I get to slowly get recognized by your surface level consciousness.
So you've just given me the ultimate spoiler alert.
Did I ruin Han Solo movie?
No, all the movies. You just ruined all the movies for me because it's
Well, he may have been on the movie level. You should be reassured, because Steve just opened my eyes to the fact that I'm actually an evil character, because I've never changed, and I am a boring person.
I doubt that.
I have done nothing but spiral through these stages. I think I ended up in the second stage of life very chronologically, very early on. And every time I get sent back to make a container for my life, I go so far and then I smash that container, and I just want to cling on to simplicity and rules. And I may have to have a private conversation with you, Stephen.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to keep the door open now that I know you're a supervillain. Jim?
David, it was a long time since I read the book, but somewhere I recall Richard talks about our false self, and that and this process, this migration over to the second half is an act of discovering or claiming or finding your true self, your core identity, and the face that you had before you were born. Now, over the last, I've only been back on this Christian journey for the last 13 years now, maybe. Previous 40 plus years, I didn't care sweet fanny apples about church or religion. But in any case, one thing that I've come to recognize in myself is that I have spent a whole lifetime curating my life, burnishing my life with writerly enhancements that I'm not even sure where the so-called authentic self and the manufactured self, separate. And I would say if I'm coming into this second half experience, it has been learning that indeed this has been an artifice, this life, this persona. I present a persona. I don't live a person as such. And that is one of the more spiritually satisfying pieces of self-knowledge that I've certainly come to understand or know.
And it's such a paradox, right? To feel that you've achieved some degree of self-knowledge after you realize that your self was kind of false. Like,
Yes.
once you really get to know it, you go, oh, that's not what I needed after all. That's never who I was.
Picking up mannerisms and language and being what you might call totally derivative.
Yeah, and it's a bit like terroir, right? Terroir is a term that is used for wine and food, right? Where, a wine tastes like the area from which it came from, literally from the soil that it came from. The qualities of that soil affect the taste of the wine or the food, right? The French talk about this. We are all terroir, right? We are all a product of our immediate environment, even though we'd like to take credit for it, we really can't. And when you meet someone from another part of the world and you realize, I find it with people from like Northern England with really, really thick accents, I go, wow, same language, but we sound so different. I guess I sound as different to them as they do to me. Then you realize, okay, that wasn't really me, I guess. That was just like the accoutrements of being a self in this particular part of the world. Right? Let me show you a clip by Rohr where he talks about being an elder. And sorry, I just want to check the chat here. Yeah, Amanda says that Rohr says that your true self is who you objectively are from the beginning in the heart and mind of God. It can't be gained or lost by any technique. Yeah, and you don't have to pay a cent for it, unlike your false self, which you may spend a lot of money building.
To try to express what appears to me to be the paradox of a true elder. And we are creating a lot of elderly people, but not a lot of elders. An elder is someone who, it seems to me, does carry a kind of gravitas, sadness, seriousness. They've seen too much. They've been hurt a number of times. They've experienced a number of deaths. You can't just giggle at everything anymore. You know this business of life is serious and short. And by my age, you want to start making sure you're getting the message because you know it's going to be over in a few years. And you long for what the message is, what this life is all about. But simultaneous, and I hope you've met such an elder, simultaneous to that gravitas, that underlying seriousness, there's a brightness, there's a freedom, there's a joy, there's a okayness, there's a contentment, there's an ability to say to the youngers, to the juniors, it's okay, it'll be okay, it will work out. In fact, if you can't say that to the youngers, I don't know what good you are as an elder. I don't know, I don't know what you're doing for your grandchildren. That's your role, right? To be giving the security, the solidity, the okayness. I can hold this together. What you see in an elder is an ability to deal with creative tensions. I look at our politics in America. I mean, it makes you want to cry. I mean, just that these are our well-educated people that we elect and send to Washington, and all they can do is what I call dualistic thinking, either-or thinking. That's precisely not wisdom. Wisdom has always been defined as the ability to see things in terms of both and. That's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. In the first half of life, you get a lot of information that sort of inflates you, while you're right, and your political party has the whole truth, and your country has the whole truth, and your religion has the whole truth. Unless you go through the necessary suffering, you don't see that this is not love of truth, it's love of self. You're not really searching for the truth, you're just trying to ensconce yourself at the top. But if you've never suffered, you'll never know that. You won't. You'll just keep believing the lie, that you're the best, you're superior, your race is superior, and your nation is the only one that God has shed his grace on. And right across the border, God just doesn't care about those people. You can really live with those kind of ridiculous illusions. We're creating a high percentage of people that way, who are really incapable of civil dialogue, of humane adult communication. I remember hearing the healthcare debate a few years ago. It's just human beings yelling at one another, just yelling and thinking that if they'd yell louder, this would mean it was true. Or if they'd use more obscene words, this would prove it was true. And unfortunately, when you have a culture at an adolescent level, they buy that. It works. So there's no reason to stop doing it, because in a first half of life culture, that works. You're impressed by loudness and by four-letter words. And that's supposed to mean this guy knows what he's talking about, Rather sad, brothers and sisters. We're not going to get anywhere.
He's a good speaker.
I guess.
Yeah. I wonder if he ever worked as a consultant for Fox News and they just misunderstood what he was saying to them. Um, yeah, I mean, I think what I find a little bit troubling about Rohr's argument is that he says that, by falling and failing, that there's a good chance that you can become someone who enters the second half of life. And yet, I don't, it's not a necessary, I think it's necessary, but it's not a guarantee that the penny will drop. Lots of bad things happen to people who continue to be egotists. They just blame everybody else. And he said that in 2011, before Trump, before everything.
Yes.
Right? Well, that's kind of some prophetic speech there. Like we've seen what that's like, where, whoever yells loudest wins. And that has sort of taken over our society, unfortunately. Another Bible story which bears on this, the young man who walks up to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what do I need to get in? What do I need to do to have eternal life?" And Jesus turns around and says, "Why are you calling me good? Only our Father is good." And then the man says, "Well, I want eternal life." And Jesus says, "Well, follow the commandments then. Honor your parents, don't steal, don't kill." And the young man says, "Well, I've done all those things." He's a rich young man. That's explicit in the story. And Jesus says, "Okay, well, there's just one more thing you should do. Sell all your stuff. Come follow me." And we're told that the young man left aggrieved because he had many possessions. And that story, that's a perfect story for this, because he's a young man who says, "What can I do on purpose to get eternal life?" Right? I want to get there under my own steam. And Jesus first says to him, "Well, have you obeyed the rules?" He talks to him in his own language. "Have you obeyed all the rules?" He says, "Yeah, I've done all those things." He says, "Oh, good. So you're ready for the next step. Get rid of all your stuff. Abandon everything that you stand for." And Jesus is basically saying, "You want a conversion experience? I'm going to throw you to the ground." And the young man, his ego won't let him do it. He's not ready for that. Very hard for the ego to commit suicide. That's why spiritual maturity happens usually when you're thrown to the ground, because very few of us would choose to be thrown to the ground, right? And that's why, like, the Eastern path is interesting, because you choose with your ego to try and undo your ego. Interesting paradox, but it works. I mean, people can meditate their way out of egotistical nature. So I think that Rohr is right that being pushed to the ground can help with this, but it's no guarantee, and it really helps what the cultural context is. And because fewer and fewer people are going to church, and those who do go to church often are told that church is just about rules, this sort of second half of life perspective, even though it's threaded all the way through the Gospels, is often just missed. And that's why it's important that we get together for nights like this to talk about this explicitly, because you might miss it if you're just, sitting and listening and if you expect church to be about rules and what should I do next? I should forgive because that's a rule. No. Being forgiving is a good thing, which will have all sorts of positive benefits for you and the world, but it's not a law. If you think of it as a law, then you think that it's all up to you, right? Whereas it's better to give up some of you so that you can feel that connection to everything else. That makes sense, sort of?
So a lot of this is echoing about an early decision that we made with our firstborn. And it's funny how, I don't know whether other people experience this, but single events just keep coming back and back as part of one's story. And one is constant, maybe it's the fall and trying to find the lesson that one has to learn. And some of the falls in my life, I just think, but I know what this fall was trying to teach me? Didn't I know that already? Wasn't it enough that I knew that and was trying to live that out? Why did I have to have it sort of, why did someone have to push me? And why did I have to fall to find out something that I already knew? Anyway.
Yeah, it's one of the mysteries of being a human being, right? That's why the spiral staircase is a pretty good image, because you can be in exactly the same position but see it differently, right? See it from above this time rather than below.
With a broader perspective or field of vision.
Yeah, that's true too.
Including other people.
Yeah, other people who suddenly seem a lot like you, even if
Yes.
your life circumstances are radically different.
Yes.
The good news is that all of us are mortal, so that people you love will die and get sick, and you will be thrown to the floor a lot. The older you get, the more often you will be thrown to the floor. And it's up to us whether we will take the hint and learn from this. And I think it's helpful if you realize that, some very good advice in religious traditions all over the world suggests don't be afraid of the suffering. You're not going to enjoy it. That's why it's suffering. But there is some good that can come out of it, and you can be a richer person for it, as opposed to idolizing youth and a perfect life where nothing goes wrong, where life is just one fabulous success after another after another. That doesn't actually yield wisdom. If anything, it yields fragility, because you're not prepared when life does punch you in the face. You don't know how to deal with it. I hope this has been useful. I recommend the book.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And he's written lots of other good books. The Universal Christ is good. The Naked Now is good.
Immortal Diamond is good.
Oh, yeah.
The Divine Dance. Okay, cool. I haven't read that one.
I haven't read that one.
Is Richard on the Vatican's Christmas card list, do you think?
Well, you know what? He loves St. Francis, or rather, he loves Pope Francis.
Yes.
He thinks he's great. He probably wasn't a fan of Benedict, but
Yeah.
Francis he likes a lot. I haven't talked about this a lot, but he's part of the contemplative tradition, right? Which really puts an emphasis on prayer and humility. And the Franciscans were the ones who adopted poverty as a way of life of being monks and stuff. So there's lots of dimensions to this. But anyway.
He consorts with all sorts of people, many Protestants.
Even Protestants, my goodness. Even Oprah at times.
Yeah, but the faculty at the center are from all over the place, spiritually or theologically.
Yeah, at the center where that he set up in New Mexico. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you.
You made some of his points clearer than I was able to grasp from reading it and from trying to contemplate it. So thank you, Stephen.
My pleasure.
And thanks to everybody else for sharing their lives and their journeys.
Giving us eyes to see. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.